Well, good day, my friends. It's your old pal Jordan the Lion. We are coming to you from Metropolis, Illinois. Some know it as the home of Superman, but today we're actually surprisingly going to visit the grave of the Birdman of Alcatraz, Robert Stroud. Daze with Jordan the Lion begins now. I was very shocked to see that Robert was buried out here, but when we get out there, I'll tell you why he's buried here. And I've got my little Christmas miracle down here in his Christmas Bucky's blanket and his gingerbread man sweater. How are you today, Jawberry? Merry Christmas, my friend. It is a small cemetery, but not as easy to find him as I thought it was going to be. My tip is to come down. They have about 4 or 5 of these driveways. Go down the one where you see this giant stump right here, because that's where you're looking for. You see, here's the tree stump, and I was looking for this big toller, this white one back here, because Robert Stroud and his mother are right in front of it. Which, there you go. That is why he's here. I kept going, why would the Birdman of Alcatraz, who's really the Birdman of Leavenworth, why would he be in Metropolis? Well, his mother grew up here, Elizabeth Stroud, and she was the only person that really was in his corner his whole life. Well, I guess I shouldn't say whole life, most of his life. Here he is. Guy never really spent hardly any time on the outside, really. His whole life was, for the most part, being a prisoner. And he would be, at one time, maybe one of the most famous prisoners in the world. Famous for being a prisoner, in fact. He got notoriety when there was a book written about him by a jailer, man who worked on Alcatraz. Wrote a book about Robert Stroud, and then Burt Lancaster made a movie about him which romanticized his story, which people that were in jail with Robert said that Burt Lancaster owed everybody a giant apology because Robert Stroud was not a good guy. He was not a misunderstood man. He was a psychopath, and even late in his life they did an analysis and still found him to be a psychopath. So where did his story begin? Robert Stroud was born in Seattle, but his father was really kind of a bad father. And so at the age of 12 years old, Robert left on his own and tried a couple of legit jobs for a while, but then ended up in Alaska being a pimp. And that's where his trouble really started. When he was 18 years old, apparently a woman that he was pimping was either cheated on her money or beaten by a man that Robert knew who was a bartender, and Robert went to his house, waited for him to come home, and then shot him in the chest and killed him. So since Alaska at the time didn't have a jail system, they sent him to an island, which I basically have surmised is Puget Sound. That's where they sent him, and that's where he started serving out his sentence. Now, his mother lived in Alaska at the same time, and basically would end up moving to wherever he was located, wherever he was jailed at the time. So he started out there and had some issues there. So first, apparently he got in trouble for beating up a guy who worked in the infirmary. He was trying to muscle drugs out of the guy and was afraid the guy was going to tell on him, so he beat him up and got an additional 6 months onto his sentence. When he shot the bartender, he was originally thinking that, you know, his mother hired him a good lawyer, and he was thinking that if he pleaded guilty to manslaughter, they would get a lesser charge of just, you know, a short amount of time in jail, maybe just a couple of years. But the judge at the time decided to throw the book at him, gave him 12 years. So while he was serving that, he got an additional 6 months for beating up the infirmary worker. Then he got into a fight with apparently another inmate over food and got written up for that, got another 6 months, and then was transferred to Leavenworth. They said that the jail was overcrowded, so they sent some of their more trouble people to Leavenworth, Kansas, and that's where he became the Birdman. But that's also where that what should have been originally a 13-year sentence would end up extending the rest of his life. He was very close to his mother, and his mother was coming to visit him. And the day before, he realized that he had been written on report by a prison guard that apparently hated him, or he claimed that bullied a lot of people. And so apparently Robert, the day before his mother was going to come, went up to the prison guard and asked him to not turn in the report because he was afraid that his mother wouldn't be allowed to visit. There's varying accounts of this story, but apparently the prison guard told him not only no, but said he was going to write him up again because he came up without permission and got out of line. So then Robert sat down, considered it even more, got more worked up, went up and talked to the prison guard again, and the prison guard said he was going to write him up again. So apparently Robert had been given a shiv, which was basically a butter knife from the cafeteria, and it was wrapped up in electrical tape, and he went up to speak to the prison guard again, and then when the prison guard didn't give him an answer he liked, he stabbed the man. He stabbed him to death in front of 1,000 other inmates and was originally given the death penalty. However, his mother decided to fight it as hard as she could, and so she went as far as to go to the president, who was Woodrow Wilson at the time, who'd had a stroke and was bedridden, went to his wife and appealed to her, being a mother, and asked her to commute his sentence. So instead of giving him life, he was given life in prison. So Robert had left school when he was just 13 years old, left home, really had no education, but while he was in Leavenworth, the prisoners were allowed to have canaries. So apparently he had a canary, and other prisoners had canaries, but they were having trouble because the birds were getting sick and dying. And apparently at that time, if they didn't take care of them, of course they would die. So Robert would take the other prisoners' canaries and try and figure out what was wrong with them. At the time, there weren't really any books or studies on this. Apparently they really just had books on birds, like farm birds, like chickens and things like that, on how to cure them. So he started researching on his own and started becoming the Birdman. It was said that he had a cell next to his that was just for the birds, that the government put a hole in the wall so that he could go back and forth. He would end up writing a book on the diseases of canaries and would have it smuggled out. Then he would they would reissue it with some additional stuff, and that would be the diseases of birds. And he wasn't supposed to do this, so that became a problem, because then the government passed where prisoners couldn't make money off of being in prison. So they were going to take away his birds. And he fought, he wrote everybody that he could. He was doing this basically his whole life, because once he got in jail, he just started studying and learning as much as he could. And so he would appeal his cases. He would try everything that he could, including, you know, like I said, researching this stuff. So he ended up getting it where he couldn't sell or make money off of the birds anymore, because that was apparently one of the things he was doing. He would sell the birds to people coming to the jail, and he was hiding notes in the bottom of the cages, which he had made out of cigar boxes. So during this time, and during his time there, he ended up writing a book about his life before prison. He wrote a book about life in prison. And he got this idea. He had heard that if he married someone in the state, that they couldn't transfer him out of that state's prison. So he ended up marrying a woman that came to visit him in prison. And that started a big problem, because his mother, who had always been in his corner, got very upset that he did this. I guess she possibly felt that she was the only one that should be in his life. So she turned on him, and where she had moved everywhere he was to go visit him, she stopped. She stopped visiting him. And in fact, when he was up for parole, she spoke out against him. So he was the Birdman of Leavenworth, and eventually they figured out, or some say the government railroaded him, that he was becoming too high profile, and that they said that he was actually running a still, making alcohol out of his cell. So that's when they decided to send him to Alcatraz, where he was not allowed to have any birds. He was, you know, he spent most of his life, they said 40 years of his life. He was born in 1890, died in 1963, so roughly 73 years old. He spent 40 years of his life in solitary confinement. So when he went to Alcatraz, that was basically the deal. For 10 years, he was in cell block D, where he was locked away most of his days. He would get, I think they said, 1 shower a week and 1 outside privilege a week. And he was in there in that situation for 10 years. And then they moved him to the infirmary for the next 6 or 7 years of his stay. And then apparently with Burt Lancaster and even President Kennedy started speaking out, thinking that Robert Stroud deserved a second chance. So he was apparently moved to the hospital for prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. And that's where he lived out the rest of his days, where he would say that those were the most free days he had in his entire life, really. Or at least since he had been a prisoner when he was 18. Spent the rest of his life in jail, but they had an outdoor corridor park area that he could go out to. He could actually go out and open his door and look in the hallway. He had freedoms that he just never had before. But he eventually ended up dying when he was, as we see, 73 years old. But what's ironic is that he died on November 21st. His death would be overshadowed by John F. Kennedy being assassinated the next day. Now, what I thought was really wacky and weird was that when I was trying to find out why he was buried out here, and I discovered that his mother was from this area, when he died, she apparently, I don't know how they were able to do this or who did this, because you see, she died in 1938. It was said that on his death, or upon his death in the death certificate, she was listed as his wife, that she was listed as his only kin. I thought that was kind of strange. I don't know how that would have been done. I don't know. I know he had a brother, so I don't know if that would have been her request or what it was, but yeah, I had read that she was listed as his wife. Very bizarre. So the Birdman of Alcatraz, he told his story while he was in Alcatraz to one of the prison guards, and that man wrote a book, and that's really, you know, how Robert Stroud, his story became so romanticized. But like I said, they did review his case, and they did study him, and they said even at the end of his life, I think they looked into, you know, possibly giving him anything. Well, see, here's what's weird, is that when he had appealed all of his cases, at that time, the court system said, this case is done, you're guilty, you're going to spend life in prison, and you cannot appeal this any longer. But somehow he was always looking for that loophole and trying to, but they did review his case, and they said he was a psychopath. He was not meant for general population. And, you know, I think the first time I ever heard of the Birdman of Alcatraz was in Shawshank Redemption. They made Brooks kind of that character. But here he is, maybe one of the most famous, other than Al Capone, maybe the most famous resident of Alcatraz. Birdman of Alcatraz, who is actually the Birdman of Leavenworth. All right, my friends, Superman he was not, but You know, I love visiting famous graves and telling people's crazy stories, and this is one of them. So thank you all for watching from Metropolis, Illinois. Thank you, Jules Nico, for becoming my newest Patreon. Have a Merry Christmas, everyone, and thank you for watching. Have a great night, and goodbye.